Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp. Today, we're going to have another episode about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and we're going to cover the war in Gaza. We've done several podcasts on this topic, and I've written several blogs about it. And today, I want to kind of review those things and give an update. We've talked to a Palestinian Christian who lives or lived for many years in the West Bank. We've talked to a Christian woman who's married to a Muslim who has family in Gaza. And today we're going to talk to a very special guest, a Muslim woman named Lamis Diab, and she'll be joining us shortly. She'll be telling her story about her family from Palestine, her time living in the West Bank, and her take on the Israel-Gaza-Hamas war. But I want to share a little bit about my story and how I got here before we get into that. So before October 7th, I had a general understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But later on, I realized I had a lot of gaps in my understanding. I knew there were some injustices done to the Palestinians by the Israelis, and that the Palestinians in more recent years, Hamas were from time to time shooting rockets at Israel and carrying out suicide bombings that killed innocent civilians. But after Hamas's horrendous attack on October 7th, which killed 1,200 innocent Israelis, there was a critical question that needed to be answered. The attack was horrendous, and it begged these questions. What led Hamas to do this? What was the environment behind this attack? It didn't happen in a vacuum. The conflict did not start on October 7th. There was a 75-year history. Now, the standard answer was this: Palestinians are all terrorists, and they teach their children to hate and kill Israelis. But that answer was not satisfactory. Because I had read of injustices against the Palestinians, I knew that some of the wars, such as when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, and also the illegal settlements in the West Bank that even the U.S. was against, these could not be defended. I then heard people I respected start to give a more in-depth narrative. People like Chris Hedges. He's a war correspondent. He wrote a book on war that I cited in my latest book, and I really respected him as a journalist and an author, a researcher. And he started to share a narrative about the Palestinians that filled in a lot of gaps. Slowly, I began to realize that whatever oppression the Palestinians suffered, it was actually much, much, much worse than I realized. So I had to hold two thoughts in my mind. One, the Hamas attack was indefensible. And two, Hamas and the Palestinians have serious, legitimate grievances. Now, one way to come to this conclusion quickly is to read a book that I read recently by a man named Miko Peled. It's called The General's Son: Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. I read it last month, and it totally blew me away. In summary, the book is about a Jewish Israeli man. He's the son of a famous Israeli general who became famous and a hero of the 1967 Six-Day War. And here's this Israeli family. They have a military background. The father is a war hero. And in 1997, 30 years after that war, something terrible happened to this family. The author, Miko, his niece, is killed by a Palestinian terrorist suicide bomber. So Miko and his family, they are, of course, devastated. But Miko had been in the Israeli Army Special Forces and knew that the Israeli military, the IDF, was not pure as the driven snow. He saw firsthand the way Israeli soldiers dehumanized Palestinians and treated them harshly. His father, in fact, had changed his view and had saw some of these things as well. Miko had to ask the question, what led these two young Arab men to become suicide bombers and eventually kill my sister's daughter? He began to ask deeper questions over the years about both sides of this conflict, and he concluded the following: the choice that I made is to investigate for myself and find out who's telling the truth and who isn't. And my side was not telling the truth. So, what did he discover? Well, the part that Israel was not telling the truth were the facts on the ground. What facts are those? Let's just list a few of them. Number one, that in 1948, the Israeli militia, before it became a nation state military, that militia terrorized Palestinians and drove them out of their land. It's a lie to say that the Arab leaders told those people to leave. No, the historical facts say that's not true. They were forced out by violent means. Also, the fact that the Palestinians' land was stolen, that Israel had instituted over the years an apartheid system on Palestinians, that they are being persecuted and oppressed by the IDF in illegal militarily occupied territories in the West Bank and a blockaded open air prison called Gaza. That for years, also, IDF snipers have harassed Palestinian civilians, scaring, wounding, and killing them. That Gaza has been bombed many times, not just since October 7th, that there are racists among many Israelis, especially now with Netanyahu's most recent government. Yes, it's true that the resistant arm of the Palestinians today, Hamas, is violent and calls for and carries out retaliatory, violent attacks that I and all people of goodwill condemn. But at the same time, there is also a history of widespread peaceful protests by Palestinians as well. So I discovered these things. I went in deeper than your cursory knowledge of the conflict. There's a whole other narrative that is grounded in historical facts. Uh, Previously, I only knew the tip of the iceberg. And the facts that I learned were not only espoused by Palestinians and their historians, but also documented and taught by Jewish Israeli historians, people like Ilan Pappé, Norm Finkelstein, Miko Peled, people like Orthodox Jewish rabbis who are against Zionism, organizations, Jewish organizations like Combatants for Peace, Jewish Voices for Peace, and the pro-Israel Jewish nonprofit J Street, who withdrew support for Israel's current military campaign and supports post-war negotiations. Of the Gaza war, the J Street president said, "This is simply not in keeping with the values of the Jewish community and the lessons that we should have learned from our own history." Moreover, 136 countries today and the International Court of Justice has deemed that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. 25,000 Gazan women and children have been killed in the Gaza bombing by Israel, and no amount of rationalization can justify it. Hamas using civilians as human shields is a myth. Thankfully, the U.S. is finally starting to speak louder against the indiscriminate bombing. But on the other hand, we are still providing 83% of the bombs that Israel is using. So we are still complicit. A war crime by Hamas does not justify a 10 to 30-fold war crime by Israel, and one that has been supported by the United States and the Biden administration. Many within the administration are calling this out, but the calls for restraint, the calls for a ceasefire, and aid to Gaza, although it's good, it can't be double-sided. You can't deliver bread with one hand and bombs with the other. So the lesson learned is to recognize this conflict is not so black and white. The nation-state of Israel, not necessarily the average Israeli citizen, of course, but the nation-state has covered up a lot of history that there is a myth, and there's a myth that's being told out there. The myth that the nation-state of Israel was a small, persecuted minority that prevailed over the evil Arab armies and terrorists. No, that is not true. Israel was founded on violence and oppression. Israel is today perpetuated by a military settler colonial system. Violent oppression eventually causes violent resistance, unfortunately. But Palestinians are not all violent terrorists. The overwhelming majority are not violent, and their rights are being stripped. This crisis is also an opportunity to call for the U.S. to stop supporting revenge for October 7th, a revenge that does not eradicate violent extremists, but actually creates them. And also a call to start pressuring today's ultra-right-wing nation-state of Israel to stop dehumanizing Palestinians in the military campaigns, negotiate the release of the remaining hostages, and push for an end to Israel's apartheid system. This will take a huge paradigm shift on both sides, not only for Jewish people to stop dehumanizing Palestinians, but also for those who support the Palestinian cause to stop dehumanizing all Jewish people. This is a fight against bad, violent, retributive ideas and government policy that lead to terrible actions. It's not a fight against a particular ethnic group or people. So that's my story and statement. So let's get into our conversation with our special guest, Lamis Diab. Welcome, everyone. We are here with Lamis Diab. Lamis is an American Muslim who is originally from Palestine, whose family is from the West Bank. She has spent time in the West Bank herself when she was a teenager. She currently is an academic advisor at a community college in Illinois, and she has a MBA from Aurora University. Lamis, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the podcast.
Walaikum assalam, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited that you are joining us today. You are friends with Kathy Shahada, and Kathy has been on the podcast 2 times now.
Okay.
And she's shared her story having family living in Gaza. And we have already had an introduction on what the show is about before that was pre-recorded. And unfortunately, with Kathy's story, sadly, it's really about her family barely surviving in Gaza these last 5 months. Very traumatic and difficult to listen to the stories that she tells sometimes. So, but today we'd like to hear your story as a Palestinian American with roots in the West Bank and family still living there. So why don't we start there and ask you, what is your family's history in Palestine and Gaza?
Sure. My family is primarily located in the West Bank of Palestine in a little village. It's a significant sized village called Betunia. If you're more familiar with Ramallah, it's about 4 miles away from Ramallah. My family line can trace back at least 1,000 years to one of the sons of the Crusader Salahuddin.
Really? Wow.
Yes, yes. So we've adopted part of his name, and he is of Kurdish descent. So part of that history is included in the way that we name our family. So
This was a crusader?
yeah,
And
so known as Saladin, I think
uh-huh.
in the West, but
Right.
Salahuddin in
Oh,
Arabic.
you oh right. Okay,
Yes.
right. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Muslim yeah, one of the leaders of the Muslim armies, right? Or the Arab armies against the Christian Crusaders, is that it?
Yes, he was Caliph
Wow.
of Egypt for a while. He had a couple of sons who then moved into what is now modern day Palestine and Syria. And so we are descendant of the son that settled in that area of Palestine. Um, my sisters and I asked my father recently whether or not we had any family ties to Gaza. It's not something that we ever talked about growing up, but he did say that we do have family in Gaza, but they're kind of, a lost line, if you will. There was no real way to maintain communication with them, so we'd really know nothing of them
Right.
directly. By marriage, we do have a beautiful young woman whose family, she was born in our village, but her story is that her family was living about 10 miles south of modern day Tel Aviv, and her line was split. So her family, her side ended up in the West Bank, and half of them ended up in Gaza.
Oh, okay. And I'm sorry, what relative was that?
She's married to my first cousin.
Okay. So a
Our
cousin.
village is of a size where some of the folks who had to leave their villages that were taken
Mhm.
over for one reason or another, our village was a place where some of them sought refuge and established new homes. Um, and that's how she came to Betunia, to my town. And from her story, we have a connection through her. Her family, unfortunately, has suffered quite a bit of loss in Gaza in the last 5 months.
Yeah, I imagine. Um, so do you know much about your family go back as far as 1948 when the nation of Israel started? What happened to them in 48?
So in 1948, it was a situation where many of the villagers were told to leave their homes all over Palestine. My mother tells me that they were forced to leave their home. They did not know if they would be able to return. They were one of the lucky villages where they were allowed to come back homes, and Betunia to this day remains a Palestinian village. There are certainly Israeli settlements nearby, but the village itself is Palestinian by
Hmm.
population.
Right. So, and then what about the story of how your family immigrated to the United States?
Sure. There was a little bit of travel back and forth between Palestine and the States, even by my great grandfather. They came and established businesses, but always returned back home to Palestine. It wasn't really until the mid to late 60s where families started to move to the States. My parents moved to the southwest suburbs of Chicago in 1969. There was already quite a bit of family established there as a support. Now that part of Chicago is known as Little Palestine. There's Palestinian businesses, schools. There's a mosque that's been established.
Really?
Um, the name of our town, as I said, was Betunia. There's so many people from Betunia living in that area. There is a Betunia club that they regularly have Betunia club picnics to get everyone from the village together in that area. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Do you hear stories from those people from what it was like when they lived there?
Um, I have similar stories. It was a hard time for them my parents are born both pre 1948. My parents are quite a bit older, so they are Palestinian citizens through and through. They're Palestinian paperwork.
Hmm.
that sort of thing. I have a lot of great uncles and grandparents that live there. Pre 1948, I would say the stories that I was told from my grandfather, he was a pretty well respected gentleman, my mother's father. He was the principal of multiple different schools. And she remembers, their Jewish neighbors coming to visit for tea, things like that, prior to 1948. It was not a big deal. That's just how everyday life was. There was, they talk about a coexistence between Christians and Jews and Arabs. She had Christian classmates whom she was in teaching college. They would celebrate their holidays together. Pre 1948, it was quite, for the most part, it was quite peaceful.
Yeah. I've heard those stories about, we have a vision of what it was like beforehand, but it was actually peaceful coexistence. I mean, I think Palestinians were in the majority of the population, but there were still lots of Jewish people and Christian people living together in peace. And that's a very interesting fact that most of us are kind of surprised to hear.
Absolutely. Certainly very well-established Palestinian communities all across the land. And, this notion that, part of the reason that Palestine was sacrificed for the European Jewish population post-World War II was under the premise that it was a land, a land for people, a land without people for people
I know
without
what
a
you mean.
land.
Yeah,
Yes.
right. Yeah.
So that, in fact, is completely untrue. We have beautiful pictures from pre-1948 of well-established cities and train stations and airports and banks. It was flourishing. They had an agricultural system, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that, because there has been some deniability about what life was like prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, and it's not accurate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important fact. I mean, if you think that there was hardly anyone there and you just walked in and there's this free land, that's one thing. But if there was a large population, hundreds of thousands of people who had developed the land and farmed it and developed and built cities, etc., that's a totally different scenario.
Right.
So you had told me earlier that when you were a teenager, you had the opportunity to visit the West Bank. And so tell us about that experience. How long were you there, and what was that experience like?
So I moved there with my mother and my two sisters prior to my sophomore year of high school. So I was about 14 years old when I moved there, and turned 15 there, and spent just about a year before we returned back to the States. I would say, as a 14 or 15-year-old, let me just first say that I loved the opportunity to visit where my family came from, and to see and to live in the family home and be surrounded by the fruit trees that were around our home. I remember reading Gone with the Wind just before I had traveled to Palestine.
Really?
And there's a 14-year-old. I don't know why.
That's a thick book now.
It is a thick book. There was a mention of the red clay of Georgia.
Okay.
It kind of stood out to me, and I was surprised that the clay of Palestine is also red. So that was something that struck me.
Yep.
Now, looking back, like I said, as a 14 or 15-year-old, you don't necessarily have the words to put into to describe what's happening. I know that I felt that there was a lot of unfair treatment, right? I know that now we call that segregation, we call that apartheid. An example of that being, after traveling for 24 hours, once we landed in Tel Aviv, the Arabs were separated from the Jews.
Oh, really? When you got off the plane?
When we got off the plane, we had to go through a different line. We had
Okay.
to be subjected to extra searches. They ruffled through our luggage, completely messed it up. Lots of questioning. They made us pay some additional money that we paid, in the airport before we left here, if we wanted to keep all of our luggage. I mean, those sorts of things were quite different. Noticing that the license plates on the cars, depending on if you were an Arab or a Jewish resident of the lands, is a different color, so that they can tell who you are.
Okay.
Checkpoints were a regular thing for Palestinians, sometimes separate roads. Now that's more often the fact because of the 441-mile fence, which is truly like a 30-foot cement wall that spreads across Israel. Now more and more the roads are separated, and it takes much longer to get from one place to another.
Yeah, I've heard that. But you said 430 miles of wall?
441 miles of
Okay.
wall. It is quite substantially longer than the Berlin Wall, quite substantially higher than the Berlin Wall. It's an average
Mhm.
of about 30 feet,
Right.
where the
Okay.
Berlin Wall, I believe, is about 9 to 11 feet
Yeah.
tall.
Interesting. And then, of course, the roads, they're segregated roads now. You can't go on any road you want. You only can go on Palestinian roads. Is that correct?
Correct, but even then, those Palestinian roads, there are checkpoints
Okay.
set up on them. So, for example, back in 1993, 94, I'm dating myself as to when I was there, a teenager, Jerusalem is only 13 miles from my village. It would
Hmm.
be, maybe a 20-minute ride
Right.
max.
Yep.
Now, people who are traveling there to try to travel there from there today, American passport or not, as a Palestinian, you're traveling on a Palestinian road. That's
Oh,
how it
really?
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if you're a U.S. citizen, doesn't
If
matter.
if you are Palestinian, yes, you will be treated
Right.
as a Palestinian versus someone with all the rights of an American citizen who is not Palestinian.
Okay.
It takes about an hour
Wow.
because of there is no direct line. You have to kind of travel around those walls that have been built, and then also pass through a checkpoint. There is limited mobility in terms of times of year that people are allowed to travel to Jerusalem. So it's much more restrictive in that
Hmm.
regard. There were certainly
Hmm.
checkpoints before, they could go up at any time for any reason, but certainly transportation has been affected, getting from one place to another. Um, you may have seen visuals of workers trying to get from the Palestinian side to the Israeli side. There were quite a few Palestinian workers that have to travel through checkpoints. Checkpoints are only open for a certain amount during the day, and if you don't make it through, then you don't get to go to work that day.
Oh, I see. Right.
And yeah,
Okay. It's not open all the time. And it takes time. How long does it take? I mean, a typical checkpoint must take, what?
depends on how many cars are in front of you.
Right. It's
So
like it's like going over a international border. It sounds like.
essentially, yes, keep in mind that the entire
Oh,
size of Israel, Palestine, is about the size of New Jersey,
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
the entire country.
Mhm.
So imagine traveling 13 miles, taking an hour, having to get through a super long line as if you were traveling internationally to cross an
Right.
international border in
Right.
a landmass the size of New Jersey.
Right. Yeah. So you told me a story about when you were there in the West Bank as a 14, 15-year-old, and something about an encounter with the Israeli military. Can you tell us about that?
So my school was located in Ramallah, that town that's about 5 miles away from my
Mhm.
village. And at the time, there was an Israeli police station located right next to our school. Um, you may be referring to the time in which we were let out early from school, and my friends and I were walking the sidewalks of Ramallah.
Yeah, the rubber bullet story.
Yeah, so we were walking, and I was probably a couple feet ahead of my friends. And then as I was walking, a rubber bullet landed maybe 2, 3 feet in front of me, and it shocked me. Those bullets are about a quarter-inch thick with a metal piece inside of it. If it were to strike bone, um, it would certainly break or crack.
Right. So
They
when you
look
say land it, you mean it was shot from a rifle or something
It
right
was
in
shot
front of
from a
you.
rifle. So I'm
Yeah.
looking around thinking, where the heck did this come from? I don't see any Israeli soldiers around me. And then I look up on a rooftop and I see two very young Israeli soldiers laughing. It
Mhm.
was a game for them, you know?
Mhm.
They didn't strike me that day on the sidewalk as part of their game, trying to strike people on the sidewalk or just to shoot at the sidewalk to see how many close calls they can get. It was pretty disturbing.
Yeah, that would be. I mean,
Yeah.
I would think that you wouldn't feel safe walking around after that.
Certainly not. They weren't, like I said, they were not even in my line of sight. I did not even pay enough attention to my surroundings to know that there was a potential for danger. I was just
Right.
walking the sidewalk of the city street.
Right. So, were there any other stories that were similar to that?
Yes, because the police station was right next to our school, oftentimes when we were outside at recess, they would shoot indiscriminately at our courtyard while
Really?
students were outside for lunch. So it was a scare tactic. And honestly, if anyone were to be hit, it would not have been a big deal to them. It would just would have been, these things happen, that sort of thing.
They were shooting into a courtyard in an elementary or no, a
High
high school
school.
or high
Yeah,
school?
yeah.
Wow.
I do remember a couple of my classmates being detained and then coming back to school. And these keep in mind, are the majority of the students that I went to school with were English-speaking Canadian or American citizen students. And they had family ties to Palestine. They were,
Right.
traveling from their villages, as I was, to this
Right.
central location in Ramallah. And there were a couple of guys who were detained, essentially kidnapped, if you want to call it that, and then badly beaten, and
Really? How
then
long were they detained?
overnight,
Okay.
at least overnight, and then they told us that when their parents came to pick them up, the Israeli soldiers just talked about how tough their boys were.
Oh,
Your
geez.
boys
Okay.
are really tough. So
Hmm.
those, yeah, like I said, those things, even though it was many years ago, those things stay with you. The
Yeah.
you know,
And then
just
you
the kind of
imagine people having to live there all the time under those conditions.
right. And I mean, you may have heard about the thousands of people who are being detained in Palestine with, they call it administrative detention. They're
Yes,
being
I've
held
heard.
without charge,
Mhm.
and they are undergoing, some very inhumane and brutal treatment, being detained without charge.
Yes, I've heard that too. I mean, there's supposedly they're being arrested for some crime, but from what I've read, most of the time it's hardly anything. It's like they were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right. I mean, there have been folks recently and in the past who have been arrested for posting on social media.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
So somewhere in the branch of the IOF, there are people who are monitoring social media
Hmm,
of
interesting.
Palestinians,
Okay.
showing up at their door to arrest them for what they've posted.
So even American citizen Palestinians, they're still doing it to the or Canadians for that matter. They're still doing it to everyone, regardless of your citizenship.
Sure. I mean, you've probably heard some of the language that is used by Israel to describe Palestinians. They've called them animals, they've called them rats, they've called them vermin. So they do not discriminate based off of country of citizenship. If you are Palestinian, you are less than, and you are subjected to the same treatment. There have been cases of even recently Palestinian Americans in the West Bank who've been killed in the last few months. Um, there was an
Palestinian
instance.
Americans.
Americans, yes.
Yeah.
We don't hear about that.
Right.
It should be a bigger deal to the American government that their citizens are being killed by a foreign government. It's not. Um,
Wow. So yeah, I want to talk about what you just mentioned. Uh, People call it the dehumanization of people, or in this case, Palestinians. So you're talking about names that they call them. What other things that are reflective of dehumanizing Palestinians?
they are often subjected to strip searching. Um, and, the Palestinian Muslims and Christians alike, we're a very modest culture.
Yep.
So, asking a woman to remove her hijab is
Yeah.
tantamount to asking her to remove her shirt.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things that they do on a regular basis. We've seen video and photographs of men being lined up and blindfolded in their undergarments, some of them completely naked.
Hmm.
Um, Honestly, in the early days of this onslaught on Gaza, some of those pictures brought back memories of Abu Ghraib. If you recall
Right.
the
Right.
controversy of Abu Ghraib, where
Hmm.
they were detained and naked and beaten. I mean,
Hmm.
really some pretty hard things to look at. I mean, those are things that they're subjected to. Not to mention the restriction of rights, just basic human rights, access to water. People regularly run out of water in the West Bank, while swimming pools and green yards are maintained on the Israeli side of things. Utilities, electricity, basic things like that are not guaranteed for Palestinians. These are all contributors to dehumanization, just basic human rights.
Yeah, so I want people to kind of get a picture of what this is like. From what I've read, you're driving through the West Bank, and there are areas that Israeli settlers live in, and they're cut off from the Palestinian neighborhoods.
Mhm.
And so what is that like? I mean, is it like you said with the driving, does that mean if there's a Israeli settlement between A and B, and you're in A and you want to get to B, it means you have to drive all the way around?
Yes, it
And
does.
and so, okay,
Yes,
and
it
then what
does.
about the water? You're talking about water supply, food, markets. What's the difference as far as those everyday
Israel
things?
controls the water.
Mhm,
So, the water that comes to Palestinians is restricted.
mhm,
They, when I was there in the early 90s, we had cisterns on top of our roofs to collect water. If it rained, we would make sure to put out large pots of water because those cisterns run dry, and then you're just out of water for washing, for cooking, for what have you. Turning on the faucet is not a guarantee that water is going to come out. That's a
okay.
regular, everyday reality for Palestinians all over the country.
So they turn off the water sometimes and with no warning?
So I don't know the logistics of how water comes into the Palestinian homes. I do know that there must be a limited quantity, or they are not held to priority for every day.
Mhm,
Drinking water even, and that's why I imagine the cisterns would run dry. So um, whether or not they turn it off, yes, they're capable of turning off water. That's what they've done to Gaza. I mean, they cut off water. They cut off the
right,
water supply to them.
right, right. So tell a little bit more about the name calling. That must be very condescending and uh, offensive. I mean, is that something that is like what in the newspapers, or just actually calling? Do you encounter settlers who treat you that way, or what's that like?
In the West Bank where I was growing up, and even today, it would be uncommon to come face to face with a settler. There
Okay.
are villages like, let's see, it's called Hebron in Hebrew, and Khalil in
Hmm.
Arabic. In
Hmm.
that particular instance, the Palestinians and the Israelis are living in the same quarters. Um, the Palestinians kind of live on the lower tier of the street, the Israelis on the upper tier. The Israelis regularly throw down trash, excrement, dirty diapers
Oh my
on
God.
top of the Palestinians who are living below. In that particular city, there are streets that are meant for walking where if you are Palestinian, you may not walk on the street.
Hmm.
There are settlers who approach Palestinians and with complete impunity. There are Israeli soldiers in the area, but if a Israeli settler is to come to a Palestinian home and attack them verbally or threaten harm to them, they are not going to be punished for it whatsoever. However, if the tables, and mind you, that settlers in Israel are armed with automatic rifles. I mean,
Okay.
full-size rifles. That is a very common sight, and it has been for decades and decades and decades. That is obviously something that Palestinians cannot carry around freely. So you can imagine these settlers, with or without their guns, coming face to face, confronting Palestinians in these shared spaces. There's nothing a Palestinian can do. Even the least bit of fight could result in their arrest versus
Right,
that of the
right. If
settlers'
you
arrest.
resist it anyway. So you talked about name calling. Well, how does that happen? Where have you heard those stories?
I have heard those stories primarily through print, social media,
Hmm.
news. I tend to stay away from Western news, and I have as long as I can remember having access to you know, non-broadcast networks in the States. So I read Mondweiss, I read Haaretz sometimes. Instagram, believe it or not, is a great source of news. You can adjust your feed. So I have news coming from Al Jazeera and Middle Eastern Eye, from personal accounts of people living in Palestine, living in Gaza right now. And there have been recorded videos of people in the Israeli government calling Palestinians vermin,
Yeah.
calling them rats, calling for their annihilation, calling for the resettlement of Gaza with Israelis, the annihilation. At the beginning of this whole thing, I think many of us who are in tune with what's happening there could see that the ultimate goal was to try to push Gazans completely out of Gaza.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. I mean,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, I've heard stories about memos or communications within the government that have those plans, and
Yeah.
they're not broadcasting it. But
even visually, we can see that they were trying to get people to flee from the north. They're
yep,
cutting off aid to the north. People are starving. People have starved to death. Children have starved to death in the north of Gaza. The entire population of Gaza is 2.5 million. 1.5 million of them have been pushed down to the very most southern part of Gaza, and they are in fear that they're going to be pushed into the Sinai and die,
right,
or
right,
that be forced into Egypt in internment camps of sorts, or that pressure will be put on Arab governments to say, hey, please stop killing them, we'll take them. But the thing is, Palestinians are tough.
hmm
They've been through a lot. It's their home, and I think it's completely indecent for anyone to suggest that they should just be absorbed by another Arab country. They don't want to leave their home.
right. That makes sense. So, another thing you told me about there's several movies, documentaries about this conflict that have been made over the years. I've watched a couple of them. One of them was called Born in Gaza, very eye-opening, uh, talking about the bombing of Gaza in 2014, I think it was, and the aftermath of that, and interviewing kids and who went through that. But you told me about another one called Tantura. I think that's a village or something in
Yes.
Palestine. Tell us about that documentary. And I'll just mention that a very famous Israeli historian, which I am listening to and reading a lot of his material. His name is Ilan Pape, is in that documentary. And so tell us about that story. What's that story in that film?
I actually watched the film in the last 5 months. So after things started happening in Gaza, I know a lot about Palestine, but I just continually want to educate myself
Right.
about Palestine. So Tantura is the story of a coastal village that was basically overrun by the 33rd Battalion of the, I think, Alexandroni Brigade, which is part of the Haganah. So if you've heard of the Haganah, it's a paramilitary Israeli group that was at one point classified as a terrorist group. They
This
were
is this
known.
is what year is this now?
This is 1948.
Okay, so this is one of the Israeli militias, right?
Yes,
Yep.
yes. They were known particularly for their cruelness
hmm
in taking over these villages. So the story of Tantura as one of these beautiful, well-established coastal villages, supposedly in this country, this land without a people, that was overrun. There were hundreds of people that were massacred. The village was pillaged. There were women who were raped. There's some deniability on the side of the Israelis where they say, well, we never heard about this and we never talk about this. So let me say again that Palestinian Muslims and Christians, women especially, are quite modest. They are unlikely to come forward, and their family is unlikely to come forward with
hmm
stories admitting that their daughters and their
Yeah.
wives and their
Right.
sisters were raped. But
Right.
these things happened, right? In the documentary itself, there are soldiers from that Alexandroni brigade who were interviewed, and they talk about some of the things that happened, but they talk about it with a little bit of nonchalantness to it. They say this happened, or this happened, but I don't know. They said this gentleman saw a young woman and he took her in there and wanted to rape her, but we don't know. So, it's really quite a frustrating movie to watch because I fully believe that everything that they don't know or that they don't want to admit or the things that they don't want to talk about are things that actually happened to Palestinian people. I was reading up on it recently, there are evidence of graveyards, mass graves in that area that are now paved over in roads.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I also want to say that this story of Tantura, if you're able to watch it, is not unique. A month prior, in April of 1948, so Tantura massacre took place in May of 1948. A month prior, this is one that I'm more familiar with. This is one that I grew up with my parents talking about.
Oh, really? Okay.
A
Yeah,
village
tell us about
called,
that.
yeah, it's a village called Deir Yassin. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
you've heard of Deir Yassin.
Mm-mm.
Deir Yassin is a village that's right outside of East Jerusalem. Um, and in this particular instance, same situation, very harsh paramilitary group coming in and massacring over 100 of the men in that village, displacing the people in that village. And what my mother tells me is that what happened is the brutality of their massacre was documented with photos, and those photos were then sent to the mayors of Arab villages all across Palestine as a warning to them that if they don't comply, if they don't surrender,
Oh,
that
this would happen to them. Yeah.
this is what's going to happen to you.
Yeah. Wow. So that movie, I watched the trailer of it. I haven't had a chance to watch it, but I do remember in the trailer there were some people that were like saying, "Yeah, this did happen. This is what we did." So it wasn't just all, like you said, a casual. Well, maybe, maybe not. We don't really know. But there were people that were saying, "Yes, this happened," and this was shameful.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were some people who would admit to it, and then other people in the same room would say, but we don't talk about that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then I don't know. Did Ilan Pappé? Did he have a big role in that film? What did he have to say?
Honestly, he did not have a major role in the play. There was a documentarian who the Tantura movie itself was based off of recorded tapes that a gentleman who was doing graduate work at a university in Israel was compiling, and he
Hmm.
did interviews with all of these the living soldiers who were part of that battalion, that 33rd Battalion of the Alexandrani Brigade. There's quite a bit of controversy about it, where even though he has recorded tapes of them, they deny ever talking to him or admitting these stories. Um, Unfortunately, I don't recall his role in the documentary. I think it was probably just a commentary. He wasn't
Yeah.
a major player
Yeah,
in
it was.
there.
Right. Hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
But he is a historian, as you know.
Yeah, he's
So,
an historian. And basically has a very you know long, uh, based on historical analysis, tells the whole story of what happened in 1948 and on.
yeah.
And um, a rigorous scholar and historian, not just someone who's reading a book or two, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's very interesting. From your perspective, why is it really critical for us to know that history and this background when we come to a place in 2024, when 5 months ago there was a horrendous attack by Hamas that people of goodwill condemn,
Mhm.
but there was an environment behind that. So, in your mind, why is it so critical to know the history?
Context is everything, you
Hmm.
know. I do not condone the actions of October 7th. I think any loss of human life, innocent human life, is a tragedy. But history does not start at those monumental moments. There
Right.
is a long history leading up to it. 1948, going back previously, from the declaration of the statehood of Israel, the Balfour Agreement going back to 1917, the British colonialists of the era kind of working to ensure that Israel, um, that the Palestinian fell into the hands of the Jewish Europeans to help establish that state of Israel. Um, the people who are living there with lives who literally were booted out of their homes for other people to literally walk into their lives and take them over. There are cases where many Palestinians hold the old iron keys to their homes.
Oh, really?
It's a
Interesting.
symbol of return.
Hmm. Okay.
It's a very powerful, heart-wrenching symbol of, I have a photograph that was done by a student at Dar al-Khalima University in Bethlehem. It was a photography contest, and it's a woman with very old hands wearing a Palestinian embroidered dress on the sleeves, holding those iron keys in her hands. They have this hope that they'll be able to return. But in instances like that, I mean, they literally walked into their lives and took over their home, their bedrooms, their pots and pans. They took their lives over. So it's, if you can imagine how tragic that would be for anyone. And over the time, the more and more confiscation of Palestinian land, the complete impunity in which Israel is able to act as the spoiled child of the Middle East. Nobody's able to stop them. The building of walls, annexing an additional, 11 to 15% more land than they've already were given by, historical or agreements, 67, 48 borders, etc.
Mm-hmm.
The building of settlements inside the West Bank where Israeli settlers from all over the world, including the United States, can move, where Palestinians who have a claim and a birth and a history there cannot return. It's called occupied territory because it is occupied by settlers who should not be there.
Right. And it's a military occupation, as you were describing.
Military occupation,
There's
fully
no
fully
freedom.
protected. Correct.
Right. Right.
If we bring it back towards, there many things, have happened over the years. If we're bringing it back to kind of more modern times, even October 7th didn't just happen without any instigation. From if you look back at what happened in Palestine over the year, I mean, there were over 200 Palestinians killed in the West Bank leading up to
In
October 7th.
2023. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not that, I can't speak for Hamas, right? But it's not that they just up and decided one day that they were
Yeah.
going to
Exactly.
do this.
Right.
Years and years of instigation, years and years of oppression, years and years of them Israel acting without any kind of repercussion to them, just killing Palestinians, arresting Palestinians, taking Palestinian land. I mean, it is oppression, it is apartheid, it is segregation, it is a people who have a thumb over them who are, resisting in any way that they can.
Right. So yeah, when I look at it from my limited perspective of really studying it much more in depth for the last 5 months, um, it's like if people are oppressed violently and with all kinds of different things that you just described, eventually there's going to be. It's not surprising that there would be a violent resistance, just like the I don't know the war the ghetto of in Poland, and the Jewish people were being oppressed by the Nazis, and there was a violent uprising.
Mm-hmm.
There were violent slave revolts. There was violent protests in our civil rights movement. Not everyone was like Martin Luther King. There were some people that were doing violent acts in protest for the injustice. So yeah, and that's you know in those contexts, you would say, well, yeah, they probably shouldn't have been violent, but that's understandable, right? But
Right.
in this context, everyone just says, well, they shouldn't be doing that at all. I mean, at least the people who are pro-Israel.
And I want to make it clear that you are correct. This is as a result of a reaction to just unforgiving oppression, right?
Right.
A lot of times Zionists in particular, and I want to make clear there is a distinction between Zionists and Jewish people, right?
Yes.
Um, the Zionist argument would be that this is a war between Muslims and Jews,
Mm-hmm.
which is something that I do not buy.
Mm-hmm.
It's never been about that. It is between the oppressors and the oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
So I really try to squash that narrative whenever someone says that. It is not,
Yeah,
you know,
because like you said, prior to 1948, the Palestinians and the Jewish people were living in peace side by side.
right. And there are plenty Jewish Americans, Jewish Voice for Peace. There are
Yep.
the new movie Israelism, which highlights a Jewish American woman who grew up in a Zionist household where she knew nothing of what was happening to Palestinians in Palestine. Anna Baltzer is another example of an American Jewish woman who went to Palestine and saw it for herself and shed all those things that were taught to her that they found to be untrue. So
Yeah, that's
there is an opportunity to learn the truth if you're willing to open your
right.
eyes.
And that's exactly what Miko Peled did, who I talk about a lot. I'm trying to get him on my podcast. He's hard to pin down. But um, he in the intro, I talk a little bit about him. He was the son of a Israeli general,
Yep.
and there was a narrative going on, and when he grew up about what it was, the Palestinians are like this, and we're the good guys, etc. And then because of a suicide bomber, and his niece was actually killed
Mhm.
by a suicide bomber from, I don't know if it was called Hamas back then or not, but from some a violent resistance. um, he started to ask the question, well, why in the world would anyone do that? And he had experience in the Israeli military, so he knew they weren't pure as the driven snow. He saw some of the things that you were talking about. So
Yeah.
then when he looked into it, he had to finally have to admit, hey, you know what? We're getting the history wrong here. Our side
Mhm.
is just not telling the truth about all these things.
Yeah.
So it's very tragic.
I do follow Miko Pellet as well, and voices like his who have seen both sides of living in Israel, being part of the military, and then finding that truth for themselves and being able to see what's really going on, and then further taking it further to speak on behalf of Palestinians. It's kind of it's an unbelievable thing to see. We're quite grateful. Kathy Shahada actually arranged for him to come visit us here locally, and he did share that story about his niece. So
Oh, so you did see Miko Peled speak in
yeah.
your area? That's great. Oh, I would have loved to have seen him. So let's pivot a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, Another difficult top subject, but the Israel-Gaza Hamas war. From your perspective, a Palestinian American, what is what have you seen or heard from your perspective? What's your view of that?
My view of that, it is emphatically a disproportionate response
Mm-hmm.
to what happened on October 7th. I mean, it seems completely kind of like base to talk about these numbers compared to those numbers, or these numbers are more than those numbers. It's just a ridiculous concept to me. But there were 1,200 folks accounted for. Some of those folks you may have read that were due to Israeli friendly fire of
Yes,
sorts, if you want
I've
to call it that.
I've seen those reports. Yep.
Some of the folks who were killed were military and not just civilian. Still, 1,200 people. Okay.
Right.
We're at a point where we're talking about approaching 40 to 50 times the number of people killed in Gaza in a
Mm-hmm.
matter of 5 months, but the majority of them killed in the first 3 to 4 months.
Yeah.
It is untamed. There doesn't seem to be an end in sight. Any call for ceasefire in the UN has been blocked by the US the last 3 times. They have that UN Security Council vote veto. So
Yeah,
um,
that's very sad.
it is very
Well,
sad.
one thing was that Kamala Harris actually stood up and did a little speech, and I've got my I have mixed feelings about that. But did you see that, and what's your thoughts?
I did see that. And okay, so let me just first go to the clip. I saw the clip of her saying the situation in Gaza is tragic and we need to call for a ceasefire, applaud for at least the next 6 weeks.
Yeah, but that's right. She only said 6 weeks, right?
What's happening in the next 6 weeks, Michael?
Yeah,
In addition to Ramadan happening in 2 weeks, and then
Ramadan, right?
right, Ramadan is happening in 2 weeks. It's going to last another 4 weeks. That's about 6 weeks. But what about the primaries in America, in the United States? When are those taking place, Michael?
Yeah, yeah. In
Those are
November,
taking place in
right
March.
now. Oh,
Right.
yeah. Well, right now, Super Tuesday is today. Yeah,
Correct.
right.
So my perspective is that it is a little too late. Everything seems
Well,
like a PR stunt.
this is the nature of politics. I mean, yeah, they're trying to backpedal. I think they at least realize that, hey, this is really bad. And no
Yes.
one is willing to put teeth behind what they say, number one. They're
Right.
not willing to say, well, you know what, Israel, if you don't do that, stop, we're not going to give you any more military assistance.
And that's
We're
exactly
going
the opposite of happening, right? So then in one vein, they're calling for a ceasefire. In another vein, they're sending more money to Israel, which they are using to pay their soldiers, to purchase more weapons,
to,
to
right,
drop
right.
US made in the
I,
USA bombs and
I
missiles
know.
on the people of Gaza.
I think I heard recently over 80% of the bombs that Israel has used have been provided by the U.S. So,
Yes.
yeah, it's just crazy. So there's no teeth behind it. It's too little, too late. Um, but I mean, if there is a silver lining, it's that at least they're getting the message that they got to do something. They can't just continue on. Perhaps that's the first step in getting them to actually have teeth behind what they say. But I don't know.
Can we talk a little bit about the Dearborn,
Yes, I
Michigan?
wanted to bring that up. So, what's
Yeah.
happening in Dearborn, Michigan?
So Michigan's primary was, I believe, February 27th. Okay.
Yep.
Preceding that, Biden's administration wanted to send some campaign managers to visit with the mayor of Dearborn back towards the end of January. And he said, no way, I don't want to meet with you. This is
Really?
completely a PR stunt. You know what you have to do in order for us to give you the time of day, right? Call for a ceasefire, stop funding Israel, stop sending weapons to them, and then come talk to me, right? So from that came a movement on the Michigan ballot. There's an option for uncommitted under each party. So under the Democratic ticket, Republican ticket, there's an option for uncommitted, meaning
Right.
I do not want to vote for anybody. I
And just
don't
for
trust any.
context,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just for context, describe the community of Dearborn. Dearborn.
The community of Dearborn is over 55% Middle Eastern, North African.
Okay.
Combination of both Muslim and Christian
Hmm.
Arabs. Okay.
Hmm.
Very tight knit community. The mayor of Dearborn himself is of Arab descent.
Hmm.
So they had this movement encouraging people to vote uncommitted all over Michigan, right? So when we're looking at the results of the primary in Michigan, over 100,000 people voted uncommitted. I read today that resulted in the uncommitted vote earning 2 delegates.
Yeah, only two. I saw that.
Can you imagine that, though?
Right.
Uncommitted won 2 delegates,
Right.
right? In the context of Dearborn, Michigan, back in 2020, Biden won that vote 3-1. In 2024, he lost by a 5-1 margin.
Yeah. Right.
So uncommitted won Dearborn.
Yeah. No, but it sounds like little bit. It's two, but then the actual city itself, Biden lost by a huge margin
He
because
did.
right, because most people voted uncommitted. Right.
Right.
So at least it sends a message to them. Unfortunately, we don't know if it will have much of an impact or not. Hopefully, more and more as time goes on, we can come closer to the election, the main election, and it might have some impact if this
Right.
kinds of things continue and the truth gets out more and more.
And that's why these talking points about a ceasefire for at least the next 6 months we take with a bit of
Six
skepticism.
weeks.
6 weeks rather. We
Yeah,
take with
right.
a bit of skepticism.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. It's yeah. Um, so yeah, there really should be a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and we're really coming to the end of our time here. But um, uh, there's so many. I've read very many alternate solutions for this, and no one really has has a handle on exactly what a solution should be.
Right.
But I have my ideas. I know Miko Peled has some really good ideas, but the problem is getting from A to B, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. That's the biggest hurdle, right? But I mean, how much have you thought about this, and what kinds of solutions have Palestinians come up with in light of all the current events?
My perspective is living as a Palestinian abroad, looking in at the situation there and having lived there for a little bit. I think a great start would be to remove the apartheid structures that are
Hmm.
in existence, um, to allow equal rights and equal access for all peoples living in the land, um, to remove the illegal settlements from the land that was set aside for the Palestinians. Even that land has been occupied, right? That would be a great start. But you're right, these are not easy fixes. These are going to take a lot of struggle. Um, a lot of people are going to be settlers can be particularly opinionated and violent when it comes to talking about leaving their homes in the West Bank on Israeli
Right.
occupied territory. Um, I think giving the diaspora the right to return would be amazing. We have the idea of Aliyah, where any person claiming even a bit of Jewish heritage is allowed to come visit Israel, is allowed to move to Israel. They'll find space for you. Whereas someone with generations and generations of family ties as a Palestinian is not allowed to return.
Right. Yeah. So those are all, when you think about it in a logical way, you say, yeah, that that's what should be done. So right now, the biggest hurdle is the Israeli government, especially Netanyahu's government, very
Yeah,
extremely right wing
right.
and much more radicals in his government that are radical extremist Zionists, settler Zionists, etc. So it seems like the first step would be a new Israeli government. I mean, Netanyahu's not going to do anything like we just described.
I agree with you. I also want to say the timing of the onslaught in Gaza, I think, has helped Netanyahu tighten his reins a little
Hmm.
bit in the
Hmm.
government. Um, I don't know. The conditions were right for him in that regard.
Yeah, he's using it for his advantage. That's for sure.
Yes.
So it's very sad. So, anyways, this has been a great conversation, Lamis. So, thank you so much for joining us here on the Spiritual Brew Pub. Uh, I know that Muslims don't drink alcohol, but I would love to have some tea with share some tea with you.
We do tea. I love tea.
I love when I worked in Africa. Uh, they had tea shops all over the place, just like a Starbucks on every corner here in Seattle. And
Hmm.
the tea was outstanding. And every time I go to my African friends in Tukwila, Washington, I have the traditional tea, and it's just so good. I love it. So I would love to drink tea with you someday. But we're drinking virtual tea here at the Spiritual Brew Pub together, and you've really opened our eyes to a lot of different things about your experience and what's going on in Palestine and the Palestinian-Israel conflict. So we really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Yes. So, folks, we're gonna sign off now on the Spiritual Brew Pub, and whether it's tea or beer, enjoy responsibly. Okay.